So I'm fantastic facility.
Well, welcome everyone to Mental Health Foundation's seminar series. Tonight we have a very experienced mental health social worker, registered psychologist. She's a counsellor, a teacher, about to get her PhD, and she's my social work supervisor. And she's got a very interesting talk tonight on existential anxiety. So put your hands together and welcome Alana Roy.
Thank you. What an introduction. And she still gets anxiety with public speaking. So bear with me, it always takes me a couple of minutes to settle in. Thank you so much for coming here and to support the Mental Health Foundation, because the money from tonight goes towards them. I volunteer from time to time for the foundation. So yeah, as David said, my name's Alana Roy. I'm a psychologist, I am a social worker, and I'm really passionate about this topic: existential anxiety, phobias of death and death anxiety, and how to best support clients and practitioners and ourselves through this journey. So I'll talk for about close to an hour tonight, and then we'll have half an hour for some questions and answers, and hopefully a bit of a live discussion. And you can share anything you want to share along the way. Okay. So yeah, my practice is in St Kilda, but I work at various universities and also at the sexual assault line at the Royal Women's Hospital. I guess my journey over the last 10 years has been working at the real pointy end of work, so suicide line, veterans of war, some human trafficking projects in India, and and sexual assault. So I think the last 10 years I've really been faced with a lot of themes of existential crisis and death and trauma. But it was only when I turned 30 that it really hit home, the work that I was doing. And from a personal and professional level, I needed to take it deeper with my clients and really not ignore the hard stuff. And I think it was a lot easier to do that in my 20s because I was so passionate and energised, the work I was doing. Now it's, having to sit with some of the really uncomfortable stuff professionally and personally, as well as with my clients. Okay. So tonight we'll talk about what is existential anxiety, who's likely to get it, and who's likely to get Thanatophobia. I can't say that properly, but it's named after the Greek god Thanos, which is interpreted death, so death anxiety. Who's likely to get that clinical, pervasive condition? Some of the key theories that can help you in your practice. Symptoms, what does it look like? How can we know the differences between general anxiety and more existential anxiety? What are the current gaps in the system, in the mental health system as well, the health system? I'll take you through 3 case studies to give you a snapshot of how it can play out in practice, but it can be very easily missed if we go down a certain trajectory with our clients, and also some strategies. Okay, so that's the word I find difficult to pronounce, Thanatophobia. So it's not included in the DSM. There's not really any standardised tests to look for it, but it's often contributed to general anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorders, addictions. It's that underlining fear of death that many people face and try and avoid through various means. It's a persistent and clinically significant fear. So it's, I guess, at various times throughout our life we will face these anxieties ourselves, but some of the people I've worked with, it's getting in the way of their functioning, their day-to-day coping. It's persistent. And it can manifest in an existential crisis, so it can reach a crescendo, a point of complete crisis, where the client may actually get a lot of support and grow, and the crisis may actually resolve. Or I've worked with people where the fear it's pervasive and it's quite consistent throughout the lifespan. Okay. So it really stems from the fear, that fear of the unknown. What are we doing here? What's the meaning of life? That concern with not being able to control what happens to you, what happens to your family, your life. Can manifest in morbid fascinations with death and thinking about death and death of others. Persistent worry, and also that hypochondriasis, where you it can manifest in worrying about illness, death anxiety, sickness, when the person might be very well and healthy. Okay. And also with existential crisis and thanatophobia, many people cover that void or that feeling of death anxiety with addictions, with various means, whether it's alcohol, sex, gambling, that inability to live in the here and the now and deal with the plight of what humanity faces, and that constant avoiding and filling that space with things that are maladaptive and unhelpful for the person. Okay. So as I mentioned, the majority of people experience existential anxiety at some point in their life, but the clinical levels is what I'll be talking about today as well. We know from the literature that for children, normally they start questioning death and the meaning of life as young as 4, when they get that sense that the world around them is not as safe as they once thought it was from inside their home. They're exposed to media, they're exposed to world religions, different cultures at kinder. Children as young as 4 get that sense of they're not mortal, they're not going to live forever. And it tends to quieten and ease off in primary school, and it can peak in adolescence. There's a section on adolescence we'll focus on a bit later. And again, in the literature, it tends to die down in your early 20s. People are forming careers, finding their partner, starting families, buying a home. It's a very focused and busy time, generally, and the existential crisis tends to rear its head again later in life, 40s, 50s and 60s, which is the typical midlife crisis, which can often be missed in therapy when it's actually that existential anxiety underneath the surface. Highly sensitive people, so people who have that personality trait, can really experience existential anxiety. They're very empathic, they feel deeply for others and the pain of others. And ironically, a lot of counsellors and therapists and people in the caring profession are highly sensitive and empathic, so professionals are also quite highly likely to have these anxieties, and if they're not managed and faced, the vicarious trauma and the burnout can be quite high. People with higher IQs can also have quite intense existential anxiety and fear of death, because they're taking on a lot of the information in the world, the scientific literature, the theology, religion, quantum physics. I've met a lot of people who are very high functioning, very rational, but very fearful because they've almost overload of information. But not to say that the clients that I work with disabilities, I've worked with people with very, don't like saying low IQs, but lower functionings that still have these fears and are very largely ignored in their day program or on their residential support care, because people are so busy trying to give them their day-to-day needs of food and shelter, and that their actual spiritual needs are ignored. So also people who are raised with really rigid belief structures can face quite profound existential anxiety. For some it can be comforting, and that comfort can remain throughout the course of life, but for others those doctrines or teachings don't serve them anymore, and there can be that crisis point. I've worked with people, survivors of cults and ritual abuse, and of course the extreme end, but very profound fears once they've escaped those situations and having to, reintegrate back to society, but also to the world that they're living in. Please let me know if I'm talking too fast, because I tend to do that. Okay. So what makes, existential anxiety quite more unique, or there's some specific factors that are unique from generalised anxiety, is that deep searching for meaning, the feeling of the void. People report actually being confident and loving life, and not fearful of social situations or, that typical anxiety. But they're scared of dying. They don't know what's going to happen, where they're going, and that can lead to very morbid thoughts and thinking patterns. They often report that shattering of identity. Whatever they believed as a child just isn't true anymore, and they're left with nothing. Their religious beliefs, philosophical, ethical frameworks are shattered, and they're quite vulnerable. They often report a sense that nothing is real. So when they look at the news or go about their day-to-day life with their family and friends, it doesn't feel real. Everything feels very fleeting and almost like a dream state. But it's not a psychotic process, because they're generally able to function and go about their day-to-day life without even their partner or their boss or anyone knowing that that's how they're viewing the world. They tend to have an overwhelming awareness of how complex and mysterious consciousness is or reality is, and the anxiety in the body that they manifest throughout their day, just as they churn over these really complex thoughts and feelings. You may have heard of Eckhart Tolle, but he frames it quite well, and I've heard a lot of clients say this too, is that sense that normal is really quite insane. So when they look again at the world and the news and history, world religions, it's when they're in this existential crisis, normal feels really insane, and they don't know what to do with that, and they don't know how to communicate with their friends, their family, their children. That deep incessant searching for science, religion, spirituality, it can really open their mind to social media and the internet and literature, but it can be really unsettling, and it can become quite obsessive. There's an increased heightened vulnerability, that wanting to know the answers, wanting to know the unknowable, and in therapy often wanting their practitioner to give them some rock solid answers to help alleviate their symptoms. Persistent awareness of mortality and the fragility of life. They can tend to really struggle to connect with superficial people or situations. And that can, for young people, it can manifest in real thrill-seeking behaviour. That mainstream vibe isn't enough for them. They want to feel alive, or they want to feel close to death. They're really tempting fate. People who tend to go through the existential crisis and come out the other end report that sense of ego death, the death of old ways of being, looking at the world, how they saw their family, their church, their identity, almost like an internal death. But they're well and they're alive. It feels quite metaphorical, but also physically quite literal. The anxiety can be that intense that it actually feels like that part of them has died. And they tend to report, and this is in the literature of course, that the awareness of just how sick society can be, and that greatest, the need for social action, human rights. And this is coming out the other side of existential crisis, but it can bring that deeper sense of how am I going to be in the world? What do I want my life to entail, and how can I be more ethical? Okay. So Irving Yalom, you may have heard of him, is a psychiatrist from America who specialises in existential crisis and fear of death. He's an atheist himself, but he spent his lifetime talking about how to make meaning and purpose out of life. And for him personally, he writes about just his social life, and his long-term friends he's kept across his life have been his point of meaning and connection. But he writes about how we oscillate between senses of freedom in our life, when you're young and your children are playing, that real sense of freedom, to isolation, whether it's that midlife crisis and divorce. There's times of rich meaning, whether it's through children, through marriage, through work, travel, and meaningless when children leave the home. And as we oscillate between those factors, there's the overarching shadow of death, and it's whether people face it and find a way of making meaning, defining it, embracing it even. It will make it harder to oscillate between those patterns, and without it becoming a pathology, anxiety, depression, addictions, and I guess that fear of death, what we're talking about today. So as I mentioned, it's less present from 6 years old clinically to puberty. There's a bit of a break there. So young children in primary school tend to be okay. In saying that, I've worked with a lot of grade 1s, preps and grade 1s that experience death anxiety. So I would say that transition can be quite overwhelming for young kids, and they can hear a lot in the playground, and if it's squashed and minimised, if parents dismiss it, the really smart ones tend to be very anxious. And I've worked with a girl who had death anxiety, persistent, pervasive, every day, every night, and she was 6. So, but it tends to be a break between 6 years old and puberty. Then, as I mentioned, in adolescence, that preoccupation with death can simmer for many adolescents through risk-taking, through video games, that the violent kind of content that tends to be normalised in video games is often said to be that subconscious level of teenagers really confronting death and facing it. Also through drugs, fantasy, whether it's through books or through stories, horror films, that real graphic content that teenagers tend to lean towards. Even rap music, they're really getting amongst it, and for some it's relatively healthy and they'll move through it. For others, it's really scary, and that's where we see self-harm and suicidal thinking and suicide. Okay, and as I mentioned, in the 20s there tends to be that busy period where people are very focused on getting things done, and then it can resurface in that midlife crisis. Okay, so Yolom talks about how existential issues tend to hide under a lot of other issues, and if we're not looking for it clinically or in ourselves or in our lives, it can be ignored. And I think we're really missing opportunities for growth and potential if we ignore it. So he talks about displacement. So people who have the fear, they feel the void, don't like their life, they're existentially feeling unsafe. They can tend to blame others, whether it's the world, politicians, their partner, their parents, their childhood. They don't have that sense of control or meaning in their life, so they tend to blame it on others. It can manifest in compulsivity, so compulsive behaviours through addiction, drug addiction, irrational thoughts and behaviours, chasing one thing to the next, so that not stopping and facing the fear, that constant chase, which I think the Western society is very much a part of. That busy life, have to be on social media, have to be doing something, chasing the next thing and avoiding the void. Another one is remaining in dysfunction. So people that are miserable in their marriage, in their job, they might have unrealistic worldviews that they're still holding on to from childhood, but they don't know what to do with them, and they're stuck and just not enjoying life. Constant search for love, which can manifest in people just from one relationship to the next, trying to get the deeper connection, that fear of being alone, and so just going from one connection to the other. He talks about existing in the eyes of others, so people living vicariously through their children or through their partner, not having their own identity in the world, their own existential framework, feeling lost. So they put all their attention into someone else or something else. There's also the ultimate rescuer mentality, which he uses the example of people that might potentially be in religious affiliations and have that identity that I'm saved, I know what the meaning of life is, I know what my beliefs are, I've got this knowledge, other people don't. That sense of safety, which I'm not knocking, but when that sense of safety is shattered, that's when people tend to come undone. And putting the other people's needs first. So practitioners can do this. I've worked with people who would never talk to a client about death or existential issues because they don't want to themselves. I've worked with people that have worked with terminally ill clients and still have managed to avoid those conversations because they've focused the intervention around, the family or the will, or skirted around the edges without actually having those heart-to-heart discussions. So it's just avoiding existential discussions. Okay. So what we've noticed is the gaps in the Australian context, in the Western Australian context, is that few professionals are willing to ask about existential anxiety, fear of death anxiety. I didn't really start exploring it properly until the last couple of years, even though I had worked, as I said, in human trafficking, people who had been, had faced, near-death experiences, sexual assault. It wasn't really addressed, and I look back and go, how did I work in those settings in trauma and not ask them how did they, what is their framework? How did they, when they experienced that, what is their, belief system around that? How do they make sense of it? And I would have done it in some way, but not specifically, clearly, so that there's that open and honest discussion around it. And there's a lot of professionals out there that are doing the same because of their own systems of death denial, which we call that you don't talk about it, then you don't actually have to face it yourself. We know that atheism and the medical model can dominate the mental health system, medical system. These are pretty general statements. It's not like that everywhere, obviously. Some amazing palliative care places, but I guess when you compare our systems to other cross-cultural examples, which I'll talk about a bit later, it's a very reductionist medical model, not a lot of room for people wanting to talk about the soul, the spirit, metaphysical, you name it, we tend to avoid it. Existential issues and crisis, death anxiety doesn't really fit in the Medicare model. 10 sessions with a psychologist doesn't really tend to, it's an unravelling process over years generally. If there's a crisis or a grief and loss, takes a lot of time. So people either have to pay or they find it elsewhere. Also difficult to treat. They've researched clinically it's very difficult to treat and doesn't have the best treatment outcomes because it is you can't give answers. It's not as simple as CBT, having unhelpful thinking styles. This is tapping into the mystery of life and humanity. So it requires a whole mix, a therapist or a team of people that are willing to talk philosophy, theology, science, motion-focused therapy, mindfulness, a whole eclectic model, which it takes a lot of time and energy for both the practitioner and the client. Yep, and as I mentioned, there's very few tools that specifically focus on death anxiety at that clinical level. Generally, it's there might be one or two scales embedded within a general anxiety questionnaire, but not specifically a tool that's normed and focuses on this. So there's still a lot to know clinically what's going on with people. And as I said, we tend to not address it, we tend to put it into other areas. Okay, how am I going for time? Okay, good. Okay. So I have a couple of case examples. So this is, mix some of the information up, but this was a 55-year-old married man with two children, two teenage children. His wife was a practicing Catholic, from quite a small Catholic sect that's not quite very, very strict, and it's the name I can't remember, but it was a very strict Catholic context, which he was okay with many, many years ago, but now he's 55 years old. He was leaning towards more of an atheistic, humanistic view of the world, and was really struggling with his wife's beliefs and how that was practiced in the home and with the teenage children. He wasn't wanting the children raised with those beliefs, but they had been, and they had them, and they were quite, they were following their mum, and they were following the church, and he was struggling that they weren't having any critical thinking. So there's a lot of tension. There'd also been no physical intimacy in the marriage for 10 years. And he presented to counselling just persistent thoughts of what, a wasted life, time's running out, I'm not in love, I'm not alive, I'm not having sex, there's no passion, there's just nothing, there's just this void. And, therapy went on for a couple of years, and there was couples therapy as well with the wife. He really struggled with the desire to just take off and leave his family and travel the world, that midlife crisis presentation where he wanted to regress back into his early 20s and 30s and just do what he wanted because he felt dead inside, basically. In therapy we talked about the reality of what would happen with their marriage. Were they going to just live as housemates and friends, and could they do that respectfully with two very different philosophical point of views and ways of being in the world? Was that helpful for the teenagers? I also, looking at Yolom's work, really focused on him taking responsibility for his life. He'd been blaming everyone else for potentially decades, and it was time for him to make some really hard decisions for his life, but which is very complex with teenage children. Then we were able to have some really rich discussions around what messages do you want to send your girls, because you might need to change the messages you've been giving them for the last 13 years. You might need to completely reconstruct your sense of being in the world to be authentic with who you are now. Him and his wife processed feelings of death in the marriage. They felt that the grief that their marriage was gone, it was over, and it felt like a death. But they were still there. So it's that weird feeling of grief, but the people are still alive. He really confronted his sense of isolation just in the world. He had a family, but it didn't really feel like a family. He had a lot of regret and loss, and once we faced all this, he started slowly making sense of what he could do now. What hard decisions could he make now instead of making them in 10, 15 years? Make them now. What purpose can he get out of his family now with their new forms, whether it's when he leaves? And how can he reconnect with these girls being himself and showing them that it's okay to change, it's okay to grow and to shift identity and to still keep the values of love and family together, but in a different way. And he started to reconnect with interests and values and people. He didn't take off and leave his family, but he found other ways of connecting with that spark of his younger years, things that made him feel alive. And he didn't really fear death, but he just feared a wasted life, and he felt like it was almost, a death of a life as a whole. So it was trying to insert some spark back into the here and the now for him. Okay. Next example is a 16-year-old teenager, and this is a really common one for me. What I work with is for childhood survivors of sexual abuse who don't get the validation and the support and love and care at the time of disclosure. So she was abused by a family member from 5 years old to 10 years old, which are meant to be the years you get a break from death anxiety and existential issues. They're meant to be years of safety and the illusion of safety, and that was taken away from her. And there was no police involvement. There was no, it was silenced. It was minimised. So by the time she hit teenage years, the risk-taking behaviour, she had a void. She had a very deep void, and that trauma. And what helped her out of that was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That feeling of having fun, being alive, and living in the moment, which a lot of teenagers do, but hers was at the very severe end, and we were really worried for her safety. She had that live fast, die young attitude. What is the point? I'm just going to have fun and live in the moment. She developed some self-harming fascination on the internet, because what we know obviously from the literature, when people are numb and feel ashamed and disconnected, self-harming can actually feel really good and make them feel alive when they are feeling quite dead inside. So helping her to understand that and supporting her around that. So the treatment, an example of this was emotion-focused therapy. So first and foremost, developing a really strong connection and rapport with her, helping her process what happened from years 5 to 10. Educating her around that you didn't get that sense of safety that you deserved, and that is pretty crucial for development, and that it makes sense what you're doing what you're doing. That's normal given what's happened. How does she understand crime? A lot of people don't get the opportunity in sexual assault context to actually, do you think of it as evil? Do you think of it as wrong? What's your view philosophically and existentially around sexual abuse? Like how that's happened to you, what do you make of it? And some really rich and meaningful discussions can come from that. Now, we explored, she dissociated a lot during the abuse, but it wasn't, the near-death experience that is publicised around, the light and the feelings of euphoria and, the good side of near-death. When she dissociated into the void. So those feelings, that blackness was trapped with her throughout her day-to-day life. And so when she was high or, having sex or acting out recklessly, that void was squashed. So helping her to understand all that. Being curious about what does she believe now? Like, how does she see the world? How does she see humanity? What makes her feel safe now? Who does she look up to? What does she value? Looking at harm minimisation, so not taking away any of her unhelpful patterns, just helping her, if she's going to take drugs, how can you do it safer? And just that basic psycho-ed around just staying safe, staying alive. But also having those meaningful conversations around, well, what would suicide bring for you? What does death mean? Because with a lot of professionals don't want to have those discussions because they worry it's going to open up the risk. But you need to have those discussions. You need to ask, well, what does death mean to you? If you were to suicide, what do you imagine happening to the people here? Or feminist therapy, of course. I'm a feminist. Is naming her abuse as it's a very personal experience, but it's a structural and political issue since the dawn of time, and helping her to redirect that shame to, if she's 16, she's going to be developing into, a young woman and a career, and helping her understand that there is a bigger context with some of this rage and shame. It can be put into really healthy, amazing work projects and relationships, and connecting her to role models and also group work, so that she has that sense of connection, that she's not alone. Because there's just so many, I don't like the word victim or survivor, but there's just so many people out there that have had these experiences, and when you connect, that the existential anxiety can start to not be so intense when you found your home or you found your group of people that get you. Okay, yeah, last case example. So 25-year-old female teacher, married with a young child, so no previous mental health issues, general love of life and her work and the world. And after having her children, so about reached that clinical level, 6 months of persistent fear of death, really morbid thinking, persistent thinking about her own death and of others, imagining the deaths in quite graphic detail as she went about her day to day. Really intense sleep deprivation, because she was researching, everything she could get her hands on, paranormal activity, psychics, science, everything she could get her hands on to try and find the answers. She also had a really intense fear of hell, which she didn't realise until this situation occurred, but it sent back to her early childhood of being raised in a church that talked about hell a lot. And then that manifested in this existential crisis, real tangible feelings of hell and fear, and anger towards her parents and her religion and her just the world in general. So traditionally, I guess I would have worked with this thinking, is it postnatal anxiety, young mum, new child, and a lot of doctors and a lot of professionals would think, go down the path of not sleeping. There's a high anxiety, potentially medicate to get the sleep happening again. But there was, bigger existential issues here, and this person wasn't unwell in the sense of mental illness. There was no trauma, just the love of life and having a family and a baby had just caused the existential crisis. So the treatment was really looking at, what is this? What is this situation? What are you in? Is it mental illness, or are you going through a growth in personality? Are you emerging through this next stage developmentally? At 25, your brain's just formed, like fully, and I think your ability to critically reflect and think is at its potential. So looking at from her childhood, what can she discard? What doesn't she need anymore? What doesn't serve her? What does she believe now? Her values and her beliefs and her ethics, and what does she want to impart on her own child and her own family? So giving you that sense of, in all this, what you can't control, the bigger existential issues in your day-to-day life, what can you ground yourself in? And getting that basic self-care of sleep and exercise and mindfulness, and people that can hold the space and the doubt and the fear, because these conversations burn people out really quickly, socially and in your marriage and workplace. No one wants to be talking about death and hell and images of dead people. People just can do it for a bit and then they get over it. So finding her a support network that actually can keep going. They can have these conversations consistently. And there was, some short dose of medical intervention just to bring her sleep pattern back together. Okay. So only a couple more slides and we'll finish up. So I guess it's important to let clients know, or friends, family, even in the most painful, frightening moments of an existential crisis or fear of death, that often there's a deepening and a maturity that is happening. You just can't see it yet. There's depth and wisdom that's emerging. You can say that to a 7-year-old, you can say that to a 16, 80-year-old, it doesn't matter. It still applies. It's you from trauma, from pain, from facing your fears often comes the greatest growth. There's often an awareness and a greater appreciation for relationships. So that inability to tolerate mainstream society or watch the news or have superficial conversations, once you can get past that discomfort, and that's, I guess, the pathology around that makes it quite awkward and difficult to be in the world, you can actually develop even deeper, more connected relationships with the people you choose to have in your life. It increases interest. Some people end up changing careers, moving countries, really seizing life, really, and it wouldn't have happened if they hadn't have gone through this crisis. They would have probably plodded along for another 10 years and it can be quite a blessing to get that that shock to the system to move you forward in what you need to do in life. Can also release of unhealthy ways of thinking. So people who might have been raised in really rigid belief structures, when they're shattered, it can be very frightening, but it can open up amazing possibilities of what you can form for yourself, new ways of thinking and being in the world that you're comfortable with, not because the priest or your mum or your culture told you to. So refocusing on purpose, that what do you want to do, who do you want to be, what's meaningful, what's ethical to you, what legacy do you want to leave. And that greater ability to wrestle with uncertainty and doubt and to sit with it. And I think that's where a good therapist, that depth psychology or existential frameworks really doesn't give answers and helps that person be able to sit with really uncomfortable feelings without going for drugs or advice, but just really feel it and sit with it. So some just basic tips as practitioners or even just people in general, which it sounds really common sense to refrain from minimising people's feelings, but it's so common, particularly, sorry if there's any GPs in the room, but GPs or just those entry points into a system where there's a really quick assessment. It's a really meaningful assessment, and it's the entry point for that person. It can be really dismissive, to say things like, you're young, you're well, you're healthy. If someone's got more, a clinical levels of death anxiety, that doesn't mean anything to them. They're facing death, they're seeing death, they're experiencing it. So you need to have that awareness of how real it is for them. Also, don't assume mental illness, because a lot of these people are really well and they're really educated and they're really engaged with life, and the actual their intelligence and their love of life can actually tip them over the edge into some pretty big crises as well. When assessing OCDs or depression, postnatal depression, ask what's your belief system, what's your culture, you don't have to use the word existential framework, but the young mum who's got postnatal depression might just be overwhelmed with how much she loves her child, and that's a massive surprise to her. That's existentially thrown her into oblivion of, oh my goodness, one day I'm going to have to say goodbye to this person that I've just created. And I think there's that tendency to medicate and go down the mental illness path when it's a human experience that really needs to be talked about. Don't assume because they fear death that they are at a lower risk of suicide. I mean, I don't have any statistics on that, but I've talked to some youth at the community school that I work with. They fear death, but they would like to know how and when they will die, and they've had no control in their childhood because of their families and their abuse. So that's one thing that they would like to have control over. So I think it's taking it serious even if they're really fearful of it. Refrain from giving too many answers, because people need to be encouraged to sit with the discomfort and sit with the unknown, and really share in the discussion of the mystery, and question together in practice, and allow them to question you and be open to some tricky questions. I've had young people, that 6-year-old in that primary school, straight up, are you scared of death? What do you think's going to happen? And this is in a really upper class area, great family, and she's just petrified of dying. And you've got to be ready for those hard questions. Okay, so embrace the mystery, validate and normalise. We're all in this together, yet we're all in this on our own as well. Human experience, but it's a very isolating experience. Develop cross-cultural existential literacy, so have an awareness of what happens in other cultures and contexts with dying and death. If you're working in really multicultural settings, how does death play out in those cultures? And I'll talk more to that in a moment. Connect with people and services that can hold a space, whether there's actual death cafes popping up where people get together and have coffee and talk about their fear of death, and it's philosophy, and there's like a bit of a support group for them. There's chat rooms online for Thanatophobia, so there's actual, Google that, and there's people just sharing how scared they are and different strategies to get through it. Of course, helping people to explore religion again. You know, they might hate their religion and be scared of going to hell, but encouraging them to tap into what the progressive people in their faith are talking about now. And is there a way that they can heal from their trauma of the church by meeting people that are actually doing it well in today's modern times? Also put this in refer to atheism resources. There's some, for people who had that fear of hell, that I refer to the four horsemen, who is I'm going to forget their names now, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, I'm going to forget the other two. Very easy to find on the web. But Sam Harris doesn't identify as an atheist, he's just been thrown in there, but he talks a lot about science and consciousness from a medical, a reductionist point of view, I guess, and they try and squash that fear of hell and of that God that's going to punish. So for some people that can be really helpful, just to lift them to that intellectual level. And then if they still want spirituality, connect them with some progressive faiths that aren't taking text as literal. So there's ways of educating people with all these resources. And promote scientific inquiry and curiosity, as I do with all my students. Be open to all of it, to science, theology, spirituality, atheism. Consider it all and figure out what works for you, not what works for your parents or your country. Eckhart Tolle's fantastic. You've probably heard of him. Podcasts and videos. Brené Brown, she does a beautiful TED talk on the power of vulnerability. So it's particularly good for survivors of abuse and probably females. So it's just developing your awareness of your vulnerabilities, but also the power that comes with knowing what makes you vulnerable and what makes you cry and what makes you scared. And when you know what it is, you can have more, not control, but more like a sense of who you are and how to manage yourself in those situations. Highlight that often when you go through these existential crises and you experience the death of an ego or an identity, you will grow and you will mature. And how am I going for time? Okay. So there's a writer called Thomas More who I love and I had the privilege to speak to. He's an American author. He's in his 70s now. He's written books like The Dark Night of the Soul, Care of the Soul, Religion of One's Own. He was originally a Catholic monk, priest, and then almost became an atheist, and then went back into theology and philosophy, and is now, he talks about having a balance of soul and spirit in your life and cultivating that richness. And you can do that as an atheist or agnostic or religious. And I'll read this. So, the spirit is that part of us and part of your life that wants more to transcend, that wants to grow, that wants to move into a better world, that wants to improve ourselves. So even going to school might be a movement of the spirit, or picking up a book you want to read. So it doesn't have to be these grand scale spiritual exercises. That spirit to improve this world, to learn, to grow. The soul, the deep soul, has more to do with the things that are very ordinary, part of the ordinary life that make you feel intimately connected. The first point is the soul needs a home. It needs a sense of home. So when I work with clients, I try and get a sense of where do they have a balance of soulful things, a home, a family, intimacy, might be children, pets, partner, objects in their home that are, really soul. When you walk into someone's home, you feel there's a home, there's a soul here, soulfulness. Food and pets, interests and hobbies that keep them connected to earth, they want to be here. It's the day-to-day ordinary things that gets you out of bed and gets you moving. Nothing grand, but if you've got lots of those things, your life can become quite rich and soulful. But if you have too much meaning and too much soul, people can burn out and also have existential crisis. You need to have that balance of disconnecting. So that's actually disconnecting from your children, your love for your children, or your partner, or your home, your family, and actually, meditating. That ability to disconnect from the world, so that you can actually go back to it and feel refreshed and energised. So a lot of the people I work with, either they have no spiritual disconnection, they're plugged in all the time, they're so focused on the soulful stuff in their life, and they really need that ability to disconnect. So it's just a little way of introducing. These are spiritual concepts, but then they're very practical and very tangible as well. We won't have time to do this, but I just wanted I'll upload these slides to my website so you can have a look at another time. But there's TED Talk, a wonderful anthropologist she's fascinated in death and how death plays out in different cultures, and she visits a tribe or focuses her research on a tribe that actually, after people pass away, they live with the dead person for several weeks, and that's totally normal in their cultural context. And if the child loses a parent, they spend weeks with the parent in that space to help them transition to then the final resting place. So it's just a stark contrast. When you watch it, it's visually quite shocking because you see what they're doing. But I think it's a stark contrast for our Western world, in Australia, where death is hidden. Funerals are, they happen and everyone moves on. Where this culture, life and death, they're interwoven together from birth to death. Meaning making, this is one where I think a neurosurgeon's wife gets up and presents it on TED Talk, TED Med, and so her husband, he was a neurosurgeon and he passed away of cancer, and just how he, in his final years of cancer, how he really made his medical team bring out the best in him during his final years so that he could make meaning towards the end. And it was just a very, very powerful presentation. Skip that one. Where are we? We don't have time for that, and it didn't work either. But if you can maybe just take 5 minutes to reflect on this presentation and maybe chat to whoever you came with, or if you want to chat to the people behind you, and maybe come up with some questions and even anything you want to share about your own experiences or that of clients. And then we've got about half an hour, 20 minutes for... Yep. Sound good? Give my voice a break for 5 minutes.